Good morning, Milind. Thank you for joining us. As we see payment wars heating up, more and more announcements, more and more mergers and acquisitions, as you're leading payments at a leading regional bank, what do you see the role of wallets? Do you see the wallets bringing the whole ecosystem from China to be super apps here and banks becoming a provider per se, or how do you see that panning out in Singapore and the region?
Thanks for having me, Varun. Looking forward to this chat. We obviously, as always, start off with the tough ones. But look, I think wallets have a space. And where they have a space is when you look at some of the underbanked societies across Asia, they genuinely solve a problem there, right? So I won't, to me the question comes down to what problem are the wallets solving, and it is actually going to always be a market-specific rollouts, right, where the problems get solved. In a hyperbank society like Singapore, there is still a question mark on what value the wallets provide, more importantly, what problems do they solve. I think to your second question on, are we going to get to see the same China model here? Maybe, but I don't think that's the real answer, right? The China model is also constantly evolving. And so I think there's probably going to be a bit of a leapfrog of certain extent. You look at how the China mini app or model has moved. There is a lot more complexity there, and it's also got to do with the size of the population, and also got to do with the investments that you can make in a market that is that big versus a market here where you need to pretty much almost micro-personalize, micro-geographically customize what solutions you provide. Your third question, which is, are they a threat or a partner? Look, almost all of the payments industry is about, we partner on some days and then we compete on some days. It's about either you call it frenemies or co-opetition. And I think that's going to continue. I think there are certain places where there are advantages to a partnership from a institution of our size, and in some cases it is much more we will compete with you head on and we'll see what ends up. That's really what my opinion is.
And when you see everyone looking at launching cards, because cards were primarily bank driven,
sure.
Now in Singapore you have multiple players launching cards, whether it's internet finance companies, pure fintech companies, remittance companies.
Yep.
How does that impact your card portfolio? Or because from a financial institution, you had a real overall coverage on that segment, and now suddenly there are a few more people launching it. Does that impact you straight on, or are they trying to solve problems which the banks were either not looking to solve or were not in best position to solve? So what's the positioning of these plethora of new card options coming in?
Sure. Look, the answer in this case also, in my opinion, comes down to what problem are you going to really end up solving, right? So you look at a lot of these guys who are issuing cards, they're still issuing cards based on cards, using cards to fund in those, pseudo wallets or wallets, if you call it that. So in that sense, great, let's get more cards out there. Though I personally don't feel like Singapore, there is a need for more cards. I mean, it's, again, hyper-banked, hyper-carded society.
What do you think Singapore needs?
I think, look, the MAS is doing some good stuff in terms of pushing genuine openness. We, from a perspective, we believe that open is where the end game will be. It's just about how do we balance out what our customers' concerns will be, the regulatory concerns and the regulatory frameworks that we operate in, and how do we then end up driving towards cashless in Singapore and cashless across the region.
We talk about financial inclusion, and one of the bigger problem I see is not the issuance infrastructure, it's actually the acceptance infrastructure, because, for example, a lot of people in Singapore would have the cards, but is it in the interest of the merchant to have the acceptance infrastructure? The cost of sustaining it, cost addition, what does it add in terms of the supply lines, what it is in terms of the processing every transaction, you have a long queue. So those are the different factors, and where do you see banks playing in that? Is there a revenue model for them? Is it a revenue play? Is it a defense play that if they don't do it, the wallets will come and put QRs there? Is it a defense play? Is it an offense play? Where do banks stand on the acceptance infra?
No, I think it's a great question. I think anybody who sits here and says this is what the future is going to look like, we're all just hypothecating, right? Or hypothesizing specifically. But I think what the problem with acceptance historically has never been putting a terminal there. The problem has been more of the upstream issues to drive digital, right, and to drive digital payments. I agree with you. I don't think there's an issuing problem in Singapore, but when we look at Malaysia, when we look somewhere else, I think there is an issuing, opportunity that lies there. I think even on the terminal side, on the merchant side, without fail, the cost of terminals and the cost of deployment has to come down. And also, the second thing that has to happen is you look at a Square, you look at what Point and these guys are doing globally, or SumUp, which PayPal just acquired as well a few months ago. You've got to start delivering more value for the merchant, right? Historically, the merchant acquirer relationship has always been about here's a terminal, here's an MDR. That service that comes in, which is either it's around the real-time payment rails, whether that's around recon and doing reconciliation better, whether that's giving new age technology that makes me able to order ahead, to move through queues faster. Pay at table is another example that I think is a huge game changer that will come across the region. And I don't think this is just Singapore. I think this is across the region.
Where do banks play in this? You gave me a lot of examples. You didn't give me an example of any bank trying to solve that piece.
Well, so on that piece specifically, I disagree, right? So I think banks are
I would love to learn which examples.
Yeah, so I think for us, from an OCBC perspective, we partnered with some fintechs that are in that space. I think there are banks that are genuinely looking at what they can change. There are banks that are looking at tap to phone as an example and figuring out how to roll that out where there is strong NFC issuance. I don't want to name specific examples, to be honest, right? But the point is, this is happening. And is it going to be only banks that do it? No, right? Is it going to be one of those payment facilitators and aggregators that comes in and does it? Sure, there's an opportunity on that as well. So I don't think banks are sitting on the sidelines. I mean, if that's your question,
No.
I think it's about...
I was trying to see what kind of stuff are banks doing versus what kind of stuff fintechs are doing.
Yeah.
And are there convergence on it, or they are trying to solve problems from different fronts?
Sure. So
that's the key part.
Yeah, I mean, banks, me personally, I believe very heavily in account to account, right? I think that's the future, and Pay Now as an example, not only for domestic, but also for cross-border, and how those problems that you can solve in a long-tail merchant with a cross-border QR when you're running Pay Now to PromptPay, for example, ITMX specifically. So I think what banks are doing is saying, we're constantly challenging as well. And I think this is where the competition actually helps, because we're being pushed to say, hey, we've had an existing, very strong, deep relationships. Because at the end of the day, the reason people still prefer banks is there is a brand and a faith, and there's a construct around the regulatory stuff where I know my money is safe. And the same thing with the merchants, right? So today, we look at Pay Now, there is a problem, and corporate Pay Now specifically, there's a problem on recon, right? Somebody's going to go have to solve that. Whether that's us or somebody else, I'm sure there are a bunch of people working on it. I think that merchant ecosystem needs to come together and needs to solve genuine merchant problems beyond just, hey, I move you from cash to cashless to drive cashless. I don't think cashless is by itself not a
value
solution.
proposition.
Yeah, cashless isn't a solution. It is an enabler of other advantages that should come in the merchant ecosystem, which will drive potentially faster checkout, faster, moving and growing the business specifically.
As a payment practitioner, if you were to look at what's your wish list for this year to make the ecosystem better, what would be your ideal wish list?
Wish list is a rather appropriate word, right? But I think there are three things specifically that we want to look at, that we need to look at. Let's put it that way. One is merchant services, right? Going beyond just the cashless ambitions. I think the second is figuring out what the digital experiences are going to be, right? You have contactless and what happens on contactless. You have QR that's scaling. We normally, sitting in Singapore, we have a Singapore view, but the reality is the front lines are all across the region. And you and I have talked about this extensively. There is no one region rollout. Every region, every country has very specific problems that need to be solved on the issuing side as well, and enabling more digital payments. I think the third thing that I think is going to launch in a very big way this year is going to be tap to phone. The ability for Android phones to be able to tap, somebody to walk up, tap a card, tap a phone. I think that that cost structure and that's going to be built up will lead to large rollouts across the region, and especially as the issuance of contactless goes up, I think that's going to just be a great empowerer of digital payments on top of the QR journey that we're already on. Both of them together genuinely can solve problems that today exist. There's a lot of lethargy in the system, and we need to energize it to be able to solve that.
Thank you for joining us. This is Varun Mittal for Admedici Studio.